Mr. Cass.
Thank you for inviting me today. My name is Oren Cass. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. My primary message to the committee is this. Climate negotiations no longer bear a substantial relationship to the goal of sharply reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Rather, the upcoming Paris conference will focus on a commitment by developed nations, including the United States, to transfer enormous sums of wealth to poorer countries. This outcome is not surprising to those skeptical that U.S. so-called leadership on climate policy could persuade the developing world to forego economic growth for the sake of emissions reductions. However, it differs dramatically from the popular narrative in which Paris represents the historic culmination of a worldwide process to bring countries together and act on climate. My written testimony makes 3 points, which I will summarize here. First, the negotiating process is specifically designed to produce an easy consensus and excuse inaction. It relies upon each country announcing an intended nationally determined contribution, or INDC, that represents its proposed actions and emissions reductions. However, the contents of the INDC itself are entirely discretionary. There is no requirement that cuts achieve certain levels, or that the INDC even use consistent formats, metrics, or baseline. There is also no consequence for missing a plan's goals. Boosters are highlighting the INDC-driven structure and the parade of submitted plans as proof that the world can take meaningful action on climate. That is exactly backwards. Negotiations have followed this course of discretionary, unenforceable pledges only because of the positions of the countries are so irreconcilable that no substantive agreement is possible. And that brings me to my second point, which is that attempts at so-called leadership, as Senator Carper described in his introduction, have not spurred others to action. My written testimony details the various manipulations that have produced impressive estimates for INDC impact. However, these use a century's worth of escalating efforts, not the actual commitments made, or else they compare the actual commitments to plainly incorrect baselines that the UN IPCC does not recommend. And this is precisely the basis for positive-seeming estimates cited in Mr. Waskow's testimony as well. A more realistic interpretation of the analyses suggests total impact of all the INDCs is less than 0.2 degrees Celsius, and using the UN's own A1B baseline, for a long time the standard, there is no improvement at all. Country-by-country analysis tells the same story. China has committed to reaching peak emissions around 2030, but studies consistently show they were already on this trajectory. India's commitment manages to be even weaker. The most obvious reference point is in the INDC itself. India reports that energy efficiency improved more than 17% in that country between 2005 and 2012. India could improve only half as fast going forward and still meet the goal that it set for itself. Now, such efforts have received loud applause from the White House, from the media, and by NGOs demanding climate action. But if the INDC process relies on peer pressure and so-called naming and shaming those who drag their feet, then cheerleading for empty non-commitment destroys the premise of the entire enterprise. One might even conclude that political point scoring has taken precedence over actually addressing climate change. Which brings me to my third point. The Paris negotiations are not about emissions reductions, they are about cash. The developing world expects developed countries to offer more than $100 billion per year in what is called climate finance. The rationale for the money, the source of the money, and the use of the money are all unclear. Developing nations believe they are owed a, quote, ecological debt for past developed world emissions, and also owed, quote, reparations for the damage from storms they link to climate change. Now, these are plainly non-starters for the United States. But the developing world is also asking to be reimbursed the cost of mitigation measures they take. India alone says in its INDC it needs $2.5 trillion between now and 2030. But if the INDCs represent business as usual, funding is clearly inappropriate. Realistically, developed world leaders are pursuing a transaction in which, having staked their political capital and their legacies on achieving an agreement, any agreement, they will now pay developing nations to sign on the dotted line. To conclude, we should worry that U.S. negotiators and their colleagues, desperate to produce an agreement, will commit dollars from taxpayers that they cannot actually deliver and get nothing in return. The Senate should preempt any purchase of a piece of paper. A clear, simple resolution rejecting enormous transfers of wealth from the United States to other countries would highlight the issue for the American public. It would tie negotiators' hands, and it would ensure that any future climate change negotiations actually focus on climate change. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you.